So today we're talking about the second book in JK Rowling's Harry Potter series, The Chamber of Secrets. This video is part of my nostalgia review series where I take a book, usually a children's book, that I read when I was a child and reread it after so many years have passed and give you my thoughts on how things have changed reading it with an adult's eyes. Harry Potter was one of those formative books for me. It was a book I have a lot of nostalgia for. Nevertheless, I am certainly seeing a few cracks with my mature eyes, so let's talk about them. Part 1. Summary. Harry Potter begins his second year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The second novel explores the dark history of Hogwarts. Harry and his friends investigate a series of mysterious attacks which leave the victims petrified. Harry also learns that he may have a connection to a famous dark wizard and is himself a prime suspect in the eyes of the rest of the school. Part 2. The Philosopher's Stone, Round 2. So there are some basic similarities between the Chamber of Secrets and the Philosopher's Stone, which obviously is going to invite comparison between the two books. You have a similar opening. You have Harry starting with the Dursleys, getting into some trouble, being rescued by wizards, going to Hogwarts, having some having the Quidditch match, having some tension with Voldemort, and then ultimately saving the day at the end of the story. And so some people naturally compare the two books, and oftentimes it seems like the Chamber of Secrets, perhaps because it's the second book, seems to get short shrift by people who make those comparisons. But I don't quite think those comparisons are fair, and hopefully I will convince you in this video that actually the second book is probably one of the most underrated in the whole series. First of all, while it does share some basic plot elements with the first book, it also does other things that are quite interesting. And also, if you take the book as part of the series as a whole, it sets up a lot more of the groundwork for what's going to come in later books. You have the introduction of purebloods and half-bloods and mudbloods. You have the introduction of Horcruxes, although of course they're not given that name yet. And of course we get deeper insights into Voldemort's past as well. All of these things are ultimately going to play a large role in later books, whereas something like the Philosopher's Stone, by which I mean the actual stone, not the actual story, that doesn't really play much of a role going forward, in a way that the key plot elements in this book really do play a big role in what comes. And so for those reasons, I don't think it's quite fair to say that the Chamber of Secrets is just, Philosopher's Stone Round 2. Because although yes, it shares some of those basic plot elements, it has a similar structure, it's also probably the last book that's fully a kid's book. We start moving into more grown-up territory with the later books, although, as I'll say in a minute, this book is also pretty dark, especially when compared to that first book. So yes, there are some basic plot similarities, but there's also a lot of new stuff in here, and a lot of stuff and a lot of setup for the later books. Part 3. A Gothic horror story. Okay, so when I was younger and I read this book, it was actually a little bit scary. I actually found the basilisk and the little bits where it's saying kill, kill, kill. It creeped me out as a kid, and also even the film in those scenes where you can hear the snake through the wall. I used to skip those if I ever watched that on video on my own. I just fast forward, move on, because it creeped me out. And of course, I'm not really scared of those kinds of things anymore, but one thing that I still noticed reading the book all these years later is that The Chamber of Secrets is actually quite a dark book, especially in comparison to the first book. In fact, I would say that there's something almost gothic about this book. Obviously the setting invites gothic comparisons because it's a castle, but it's more just the sort of feel of the book. The snake in the walls, and the introduction of dark magic and dark wizards, and them going down into the the belly of the castle, well, underneath the castle at the end of the story. It just has lots of dark themes, and they spend more time in the forest. Obviously they do that in the first book as well, but just this whole book has this sense of a dark murder mystery feel to it. Of course people aren't getting killed, they're just getting petrified, but it still has that feel, and I think it's a really well crafted atmosphere. Even smaller things like the Death Day party, you're having a celebration for the dead, and even things like Nocturne Alley being introduced as opposed to the bright, lush Diagon Alley. All these little things just adding elements of darkness and just creating a much more unsettled and dark story in comparison to the first book, which by and large it's mostly happy, it's mostly entertaining, with some darker stuff coming in really only at the end and in the bit in the forest. And of course we have the central plot with Ginny and the Chamber of Secrets, and the idea, I didn't really notice it that much at the time, but the idea that there's this message written in blood that says her body will lie in the chamber forever is like horrifying, and really is something out of The Monk or something, that level of terror when you think about that. And it's surprising that Rowling just got away with this in a kid's book. And for me, this is what gives the second book that edge over the first book. I just prefer the more gothic, dark setting. I find that more entertaining, and I think it's just a very well crafted atmosphere as well. Rowling shows that she can tell a good mystery and also a good horror story. Part 4. The Dark Side of the Wizarding World. So another difference between the first two books is that in the first book, Harry is just filled with wonder at the magical world, as is the reader. We're being introduced for the first time to magic and to all of the various aspects of this world, whether that's the mythical creatures that inhabit it, whether it's Hogwarts and its secrets, whether it's spells and just the wizarding people. All of the wonderful bright side is shown in that first book. And it makes sense for Harry as a character that he would focus on that too. He's from he has a terrible upbringing where his life has been hell. And so when he sees this escape into this wonderful world, it's going to appear, amazing and perfect and flawless. And with the exception of Voldemort, pretty much it seems that way. Everyone seems pretty nice. And even the Slytherins, they just come across as bullies, but they don't come across as, evil people necessarily. But when we move into the second book, some of that sheen has started to wear off, and Rowling introduces some of the darker elements to the wizarding world. And so by the end of the book, we realise that the wizarding world, for all its wonder and magic, has exactly the same problems that the Muggle world has. The introduction, obviously, of the notion of purebloods and mudbloods is the main thing here, because essentially that is an introduction of racism into the magical world. And this is something that Harry has to grapple with in this book. But also things like Nocturne Alley. You have this alternative place where the dark wizards go, where creepy things happen, and you don't really want to go down there. And that's something that really just wasn't focused on in the first book. But now that Harry is more familiar with the world, he's starting to see that it does have this darker underbelly, and that underbelly stretches far beyond just Voldemort. It seems to me that that is what the Chamber of Secrets really brings to the series. It's the introduction of these maturer themes. It's the introduction of darkness into what, in the first book, is just presented as a zany, fun world with just a bad guy hiding somewhere. And that again is another reason why I think the Chamber of Secrets has a bit of an edge, because it just seems to present a more realistic world, one that does have its darker side. Part 5. Most underrated Harry Potter book? Like I said earlier, I really do think the Chamber of Secrets is the most underrated of all of the Harry Potter books. Whenever I look at ranking articles or watch videos that rank them, the Chamber of Secrets is usually consistently either at the lower end or usually just at the bottom. Very consistently it's there. And people give reasons like, it just copies the first book. It's got lots of plot conveniences in. Well, most of Rowling's books have plot conveniences, and that's certainly something that I don't really think she ever improves upon as a writer, really. And so I don't really see why that specific flaw is especially bad here. Although that being said, I suppose it is kind of ridiculous to think that in every single case, the basilisk would not kill a student, and that every time it just so happens that there is some way that the victim has been able to see the basilisk in some other way. I have read fan theories that try and say that this was deliberate, but even then it's like, even if it was deliberate, that Ginny controlling the basilisk was able to make it just look at the victim at the appropriate time, even that still seems highly implausible. So yes, there could be an explanation there, but it's not forthcoming, and even that sounds kind of contrived. So, the book does have its issues as far as plot conveniences go, but, that's something in Rowling's other books as well, and so I don't really take that to be a knockdown argument for why this is definitely the worst of the bunch. But outside of that, I think it improves upon almost everything that happened in the first book. Even the characters, in the first book, a lot of the characters, especially the side characters, they don't have much time to develop. And that's even true a little bit of Ron and Hermione, and especially the friendship between the three. I mean, it takes about, I think, half of the book almost for Hermione to even become included among the friends. And so it's not really until this book and in the third where I'd say their friendship really solidifies. But here we start to have a development of that relationship and adding a bit more depth. I also found that the side characters just get a little bit more time to shine in this book, whether it's Professor Sprout or whether it's Dumbledore with Harry going to his office a few times. All of these characters are just slowly coming to life and getting a little bit more time and a little bit more development. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, Rowling no longer has to spend huge portions of the book introducing her world. Yes, she introduces lots of new things in this story, but most of the groundwork was done by the first book. And so in this book, she can just take a bit of a step back, to expand on some of those side characters and to get more into the complexities and subtleties of the world. And so, given all of this, it seems to me that the Chamber of Secrets is just a big improvement over the first book. That's not to say the first book is a bad book. I don't really think there are bad books in the Harry Potter series, but it is to say that I do think this book is one that you should try and maybe give a bit more time to, because I think there's a lot going on in this story in terms of the things Rowling introduces, the themes she grapples with, and how it fits in the overall narrative that seem to get often overlooked when people just usually put this right down at the bottom of their lists. Part 6, Gilderoy Lockhart. So although I didn't do this with the first book, I think it would be fun to talk about specifically about the defense against the dark arts teacher in every book where that's relevant, because I think that was always, for me, that was always one of the big draws of the Harry Potter books. It was who is going to be the teacher this time around. And Gilderoy is an interesting one because in many ways he's one of the least consequential teachers that they have. Every other teacher is either a big villain in the way that Quirrell was, or is a teacher that's going to play some significant role in Harry's life. Obviously Lupin is like a father figure. Mad-Eye Moody, maybe he doesn't play as much of a big role because he only appears fleetingly after that, but he's still someone who is very much in Harry's life. Whereas Gilderoy is just this ridiculous fool of a character who Harry doesn't really get on with. Nevertheless, he's also one of the most entertaining and ridiculous characters that Rowling comes up with, and he's definitely one of my favourites, and I love that she brings him back a little bit for the 5th book. Maybe she didn't need to do that, maybe it's a bit of an indulgence, but I enjoy the fact that she brought him back. Also, what I like about Lockhart is she's an example, I think, of Rowling just having she wants to have a type of character. She wants to introduce a type of person into her world. And she does this with other characters like Rita Skeeter, for example, or Cornelius Fudge even. She seems to have certain types that she dislikes. She dislikes that kind of sneaky reporter. She dislikes these incompetent political leaders. And so she creates characters in order to maybe, vent or just poke fun at those types of people. And it seems to me that Gilderoy is one of those characters. She just wanted to have some nonsense fraud type that everyone loves, but is ultimately vapid. What's also interesting about Lockhart is that it allows us to kind of understand the difference between Harry as a celebrity and Gilderoy as a celebrity. And it really puts the two into sharp focus. Because in many ways, Harry probably feels like Gilderoy, in that he doesn't obviously, he didn't do anything to save the world from Voldemort. He was just, there and protected by his mother. It was really her that did it. And so he probably feels, maybe to some extent, that he hasn't got his own achievements. But the difference, of course, between Harry and Gilderoy is that Harry doesn't try to live off of his fame. He doesn't want people to look at him and to, wow, look at me, I did this thing that I didn't really do. He doesn't do that. And so through Gilderoy, Rowling is kind of able to show some of the key differences between Harry as someone who's well known and famous and someone who also is a celebrity but ultimately is worthless. And I like that contrast, and I would say maybe that's the reason why Gilderoy is there, just to allow Rowling to explore on that idea. Part 7, Conclusion. Overall, I think The Chamber of Secrets is an underrated book. It builds upon the themes and the story of the first book by adding some darkness, by showing that this wonderful magical world that we were introduced to in the first book has its own dark side, its own problems, and Harry has to learn now to navigate this world that has its own unique problems. This book was actually better on a reread for me. It didn't really go down in my estimation at all. Aside from picking up on some of the ridiculous conveniences throughout the book, I just think it's a great time. I can see more what Rowling was doing in terms of adding those dark elements, and so I appreciated it probably even more than I did back in the day. Alright, that's everything that I want to say about this book. Let me know what you think of The Chamber of Secrets in the comments. Do you think, like many people seem to, that it's one of the worst books in the world? Or do you think, or at least in the series, or do you think that it's an underrated gem that needs a little bit more love and attention? I look forward to talking with you in the comments, but until next time, ta-ra!